Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in just another minute or two. We're waiting for a few people to find their links and log on. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone. Welcome to our panel on youth and intergenerational dynamics in environmental peacebuilding. It's a pleasure to be part of such a diverse panel and also with people I can already see from attendees in the audience as well, to be here today to learn, to discuss the critical role that youth and intergenerational collaboration play in addressing environmental challenges and promoting peace. Our discussion today will focus on how different generations can work together to build sustainable and peaceful societies, especially in the face of climate change and environmental degradation. To begin, I'd like to set a few rules of engagement as established by the Environmental Peacebuilding Association, and which we're going to also be following in our panel from panelists to participants. First, this panel is a safe space for discourse and exchange. As panelists, we will be respectful of one another, even if we have differences of opinion, and we expect the same from participants as well in questions that you may ask or comments you may offer in the chat. Harassment will not be tolerated. The event is being recorded and will be available online afterwards, but the Q&A at the end will not be recorded. To begin, in recent years, the discourse on climate change has increasingly recognized the need for intergenerational cooperation. However, the unique contributions of younger generations to environmental peacebuilding have not always been addressed, appreciated, or leveraged. This panel aims to bridge that gap by exploring various environmental peacebuilding initiatives, including environmental education, watershed management, energy cooperation, and climate and conflict-sensitive advocacy activism. Our panelists, comprising both academics and practitioners, will share recent and emerging research and insights that highlight the importance of intergenerational dynamics in environmental peacebuilding. By the end of the session, we hope to have deepened our understanding of how these issues manifest in diverse contexts and how collaborative efforts across generations can contribute to shared goals of mitigating conflict while engaging in environmental stewardship and action. We're going to follow the order of presentation as listed in the association's program. So we're going to open with Bota Sharipova, who is pursuing a PhD in water cooperation, conflict, and diplomacy at the IHE Delft Institute for Water Education in the Netherlands. She has hands-on experience addressing water-related challenges in transboundary settings and engaging with youth in Central Asia through her work at the International Fund for Saving the Aral Sea and the International Secretariat for Water. She's currently focusing her doctoral research on the importance of trust in transboundary water cooperation. I look forward to hearing from you, Bota.
Thanks for the introduction, Ambreen, and I'm going to share my slide. Do you see it now?
Yes, we see it.
Great, thanks a lot. Happy to be here today and share some insights about meaningful youth engagement in enhancing transboundary water cooperation, specifically from the case of the Aral Sea Basin. Aral Sea Basin is located in Central Asia, and this is basin with two major transboundary rivers. You can see it on the map on the right. It is Sirdarya River and Amudarya rivers. And this region is also very well known for its environmental disaster, desiccation of the Aral Sea Basin, where during 40 years, the fourth biggest lake in the world lost 90% of its surface area. This basin and these two transponder rivers are shared between 5 countries: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. And what is interesting about this basin is that all 5 countries sharing this basin used to be part of USSR, and they became independent in 1991, so 33 years ago. These countries speak common language as a second language, Russian. They also have some similar traditions, culture, history. In this basin, currently, these countries face significant challenges in terms of their cooperation in relation to managing of their shared resources. So that upstream countries, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, want to develop hydropower potential, versus downstream countries, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, want to use water for agriculture. So there is a high conflictual potential between those countries. And the youth in this basin is viewed by outsiders from the basin, by donors, international organizations, but also by local decision makers as agents of change, those who can change the current stalemate, let's say, and also to help countries to cooperate better. However, when we speak about age divide or generational divide, it is not actually only about age, because when countries became independent 33 years ago, there were major political and economical and also educational changes in those countries. And then there was a major shift from plant economy to market economy, and there was a major shift in ideology and values of in these countries, and also in terms of how water and the environment is perceived. And therefore, when we speak about intergenerational dynamics in this basin, we should keep in mind that it's not only about age, but young people represent the people of a new formation for decision makers in the basin, who are at the age of usually 55 or 60 years. And young people are represented by a new generation of people who are completely different from the previous generation, from decision makers. Why I find this problematic is that there are very high expectations that young people are going to change the current situation or to bring these conflicts to resolution, let's say. But at the same time, what we can see is that there is support from two major groups, from donors, international organizations, and from local decision makers, and they have different means to support young people. However, what I see is that this support is not adequate to all the challenges and all the constraints that young people are actually facing on the ground, and therefore they cannot significantly contribute to enhancing transboundary cooperation. And for example, from donor side, they're supporting youth by providing finances for visiting international, national, regional events, or facilitating water youth networks. And local decision makers are providing young people speakers role at different events, and then they mention young people in their statements or declarations or documents. But throughout my research, what I realized is that actually through donors' initiatives which are there, young people still face lack of transparency, or that those who are not speaking English language are not supported by this kind of initiatives. They are designed mostly for English speakers, while those who are actually those young people who have certain connection to decision making, they actually speak only local languages and they don't know English that well. And then they also face inactiveness of young people or not that much interest to be engaged in solving environmental issues. Then when we turn into local decision maker support, we can see that interestingly, that young people are allowed to speak only when donors are there present at the meetings, or they usually speak last, or they are only invited to speak or expected to speak only about youth involvement and youth engagement, youth being agents of change, not directly discussing or sharing their opinion about issues which are discussed by, let's say, real decision makers. And I will actually show you here on these pictures that were taken from social media accounts of International Fund for Saving the Sea and Kaifo Water Network, which was supported by by donors. And here you can see that young people are having these nice pictures with one of the major decision makers in the region, or on the second picture, young person is speaking on a panel together with other speakers. But on the third picture, you can see actually how the decision making is taking place. So this is the meeting of the Interstate Commission for Water Coordination in Central Asia. This is where countries discuss together how they're going to manage their shared resources. And there you can see, well, first of all, there are no women, as you can see. And secondly, that there are no young people in this room. So which actually can demonstrate to us that young people are more like having their own, let's say, not that serious space, versus like older people are having their more serious space where they can speak serious business, let's say. And this also shows us weak institutional flexibility, that there's very limited space to integrate youth into decision-making and transboundary water cooperation. And there are political factors as well, that transboundary cooperation in the basin is challenging by itself, but also we should also remember that in Central Asia, all countries are autocracies, and we can say that they are not fully democratic. And this is very centralized decision-making system, which means that activeness of young people or other civil society groups is not that preferred, or is not favorite, let's say, behavior of the government. Then this is also very strongly linked to cultural factor. There in this basin, in these countries, we can see very strong social hierarchy, which means that age is very important. So you're expected to respect a lot and not to speak before all elders speak, for example. Also, this goes for the position. Those who are higher in the position, you are not expected to oppose or say something something which doesn't agree with this. Then again, as part of the culture, inactiveness or being passive was always more virtue compared to being more active. And then, of course, there are social factors which are not unique here. It's lack of social elevators for young people, nepotism, corruption. Then there is also this affective factor of frustration of young people from their inability to meet those expectations, because then now with the support of donors and partly from push, because of the push from them, also policy makers are also highlighting the role of youth, kind of, pushing the responsibility towards youth, saying, okay, you are expected now to contribute to transboundary cooperation between those countries. But here on these pictures, you can see, for example, first picture of decision makers signing agreements about transboundary rivers, youth having completely separate space for their own. And on the third picture, you see how these two meet. And here you can see that younger people are more helping with some administrative functions of like bringing papers and bringing coffee, tea, this kind of role. So with that, I would like to conclude that saying that this means to support young people in transboundary cooperation in Central Asia does not would not allow or would not create enabling environment for them to bring real change unless certain political, economic factors or conditions will change on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bota. Thank you. Okay, our next speaker is going to be Natalija. And Natalija works at the intersection of water policy and positive peace. Globally, she has spoken at the UN High-Level Political Forum on the role of youth in transboundary water governance, was a founding member of the Water Youth Network, and is an advisor to UNEP's inaugural Faith for Earth Youth Council. Natalija is a trained mediator and facilitator. She's a Rotary Peace Fellow graduate of ICU in Tokyo, IHE Delft in the Netherlands, and the University of Toronto. The floor is yours, Natalija.
Thank you. It's good to be with you all this morning, this afternoon, this evening. So I'll be speaking with a focus on Great Lakes and how to build positive peace. I function as both a practitioner and as an independent researcher. So first, a little bit of the theory that inspires my ethos. Peace is very much the way in terms of how we gather and in terms of how workshops and the work is designed. Now, Environmental peacemaking has considerably evolved, and we see new dimensions being added, and this is something that I'd like to speak to in this presentation. Specifically, the idea of moving just from a negative peace, which is the absence of violence, to positive peace. Martin Luther King articulated this idea. Johann Galtung studied it in a more academic setting. So what is violence? It's when human beings are unable to express themselves in their fullest. And then what is the opposite of that, or the positive peace? I see it more akin to the phenomenological peace, where different frames of knowing are conceptualized in a non-hierarchical way. So moving beyond just kinetic violence to also ideological violence in terms of what ways of being in the world are validated. And this was originally done within the Great Lakes watershed, looking at how to braid Indigenous and non-Indigenous worldviews. Increasingly, practitioners in the resource space are talking about the need for an ontological shift, and I would argue that that also extends to how we plan and foresight, and not colonizing futures, but allowing for multiple different futures to emerge and being inclusive in that process of articulating what might happen and what we bring into that sense-making process. Another aspect of theory that we'll be drawing on is youth leadership roles. And this is research that was done that Bota was also a part of, specifically focusing on young people as a well-being leader, as a provider. So these are two new roles that previously weren't articulated in the leadership literature, as well as the role of young people as thought leaders, in part through the way in which, as researchers, we can do participatory action research and also demonstrate and research new ways of being and convening. So this is an example of the roles in two different case studies, also applied at different scales. And in this presentation, I will speak to the local scale, which is not represented here. The reason that I did watershed-based civic circles as a methodology was in response to the democratic decline that we're seeing globally, the lack of civic space for dialogue. Combination also of the triple planetary crisis, which impacts everyone. Earth is the shared home after all. And the way in which environmental policies are developed very much need to be inclusive. We cannot implement the SDGs without that sense of safe and just Earth system boundaries. And that takes cooperation, again, dialogue. So what does this mean on a very local scale? So climate justice in cities, these are two images or four images, but one side is from a more affluent neighborhood in Toronto, and the other one is from a poorer neighborhood in Toronto. So you can see in the more affluent neighborhood, there's more green spaces. There's been an effort to naturalize the creek systems, whereas in the bottom picture, when there is a heat wave, people are going to be much more heat stressed. There's less opportunities for also mental and emotional peace in that connection to nature as well, in addition to the physiological impact of extreme heat. And then we're also seeing at the local scale that there's already contestation in terms of how land use planning decisions are being made and the way that nature is conceptualized as a resource or as something that is sacred. So the provocation was to work in community within a physical location to build a cohesive identity tied to the watershed using dialogues. Beginning with the watershed, because this is a natural biophysical area that catches a diversity of people. And so this is an example from the Toronto Region Conservation Authority that does quite a bit of work when it comes to managing the water resource system, preventing flooding, mitigation against invasive species, working cross-jurisdictionally as well to preserve that natural heritage system. And so we focused on the Humber River watershed and Etobicoke Creek for the first two pilots of these dialogues. What's missing in the approach by conservation authorities is that ontological shift. Looking at multiple different actors and incorporating their tacit knowledge, specifically bringing in worldviews that are Indigenous. So there's been talk of traditional ecological knowledge and how to integrate that into Western science, but there's a risk of instrumentalizing a whole worldview and belief system. And so there are values that I'm sorry, they're testing the fire in my building. I'm not sure if you can hear what's happening in the background. No, good. Seems like amazing. Okay. So part of the work is an ontological shift, which means moving beyond just looking at the neoliberal or the realist analysis of why we act and how we make decisions, moving through into what is more of a second dimension, looking at the cultural analysis and identity, to the political ontology, which is incorporating a fourth dimension, that is relationships that are built through time. And then this one opens up much more room for the type of peace that we can build and much more space in terms of what we imagine to be possible. And that is where that foresight piece comes into play again, that idea of what do we legitimize as being possible, which values do we bring into peace building? So ontology worldviews deals very much with that idea of what can even be known, what is possible. And so in working in circle, in bringing diverse groups of local people together in intergenerational settings, it demonstrates how to discuss in a non-hierarchical way. This is a very ancient practice in many different cultures all over the world. We all have the social technology for sense making and building peace. So essentially, the proposal was to protect, restore, and regenerate natural systems by having policy dialogue in this way that's participatory social infrastructure, and to develop the skills for deliberate democracy and build that positive peace in this process. This is an example of one that was done in Etobicoke Creek. The second that was done in the Humber River watershed. We also used tools that had a more visual component as well, tied to the SDGs, where people could vote on what was working and what wasn't working in terms of social, economic, environmental indicators in their community. It took place in a traditional teaching space, and so we weren't really allowed to take photos of inside the lodge. And then we've also been engaging in community events, planning for future circles going into the fall, allowing community to give input in different creative ways, whether that be very young people drawing what they see when it rains, both positive and negative, but also using it as an opportunity to speak more about what the watershed is and how people relate to it, and having these little demonstrations you can see in the top right and the bottom right examples of pervious and impervious watershed. So what happens when rain hits areas that soak through or not? So just using lots of different creative methods, again, to demonstrate different forms of research that are also inclusive of the community, that also engage the community, and that also try to build a sense of well-being and providing something, a service for connecting that previously wasn't there. We're not yet at the stage to fully measure the outcomes in terms of what happens in the policy process, because there's ongoing conversations with the Conservation Authority, and there will be yet another circle taking place in the fall that's tied to a watershed plan for the Humber River watershed. But this is what we hope to contribute to and we'll be assessing. For now, what we've heard is that the participants are grateful for having this type of space to exchange more tacit knowledge, as well as to speak to values that usually aren't articulated in more formal top-down consultation processes. It was inspired by some past projects that had a similar ethos in the Balkans, also using biodiversity as a metaphor for including multiple people. So again,
One more minute.
Peace through how we connect to nature and to each other. And I'll just leave us with an ethos that has guided this all the way through, with that idea of phenomenological peace informing environmental peace building. And so if there's to be peace in the world, there must be peace in the nations. If there's to be peace in the nations, there must be peace in the cities. If there's to be peace in the cities, there must be peace between neighbors. And if there's to be peace between neighbors, there must be peace in the home. For there to be peace in the home, there must be peace in the heart. So it's all in where and when and now for building it. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalija. I'd like to now introduce my dear friend Ambreen, who's going to go next. Ambreen Ben-Shmuel is a PhD candidate in sociology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Her research focuses on organizations at the intersection of geopolitical conflict and the climate crisis, exploring this from gender, generational, and intersectional perspectives. Ambreen is a research fellow at the Israeli Foundation, the Truman Institute for the Advancement of Peace, and the Laffer Center for Women's and Gender Studies. Ambreen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mo. Before I begin, I want to make two comments. First, to acknowledge the complex and often polarizing nature of the Israeli-Palestinian context in general, and all the more so during this painful political period. The research subjects at the heart of this work have been deeply impacted, especially over the past 8+ months, and yet many continue to engage, seeing the only way out of this situation is working together and with the support of the international community. That said, this research was conducted mostly from 2020 to 2022, so prior to this war. Second, while this particular study focuses on the Palestinian-Israeli context, there are implications for other environmental peacebuilding and social movement organizations. I'd like to open with two quotes that capture the generational perspectives. First, from Amir, a younger Palestinian member of the Center for Transboundary Environmental Cooperation. CTEC is a small beacon of light in a desolate geopolitical desert, but they're out of touch with the zeitgeist of this era, the progressive and ecological movements. We're asking them to take us into account. Without us, they're just a mirage. And from Daniel, a senior Israeli member. Young people don't buy into the peace process as much as older people do, and I think in part it's because they have nothing to latch onto. They have the intifadas and Gaza wars. The older generation, even though they experienced that, have memories of before, when the world was different and there was still hope and possibility, and more cooperation than there has been since the Oslo peace process. In this study, I'm following a story of intergenerational dynamics, struggle, and change. In this presentation, which is an adaptation of my work for this audience in the empirical field, I aim to address how do generational perspectives shape environmental peacebuilding organizations in the context of ongoing political conflict? To understand these dynamics, I draw on Karl Mannheim's theory of sociological generations, which posits that generations are shaped not just by age, but by shared historical and political experiences. I also draw on social movement literature and an understanding of political generations, which traditionally argues that generations can form around protest phases, where people, regardless of their age, build collective identities around time of entry into a movement. Instead of looking at this around protest phases, I see a critical juncture around conflict phases, namely a transformative period during which you have a distinct before and after understanding, like the Oslo peace process, a period of peacemaking to a regression into violence in the failure of the process. These shifting periods can have a big impact on peace organizations. I explore how different generations formed during distinct phases of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict develop unique collective identities and understandings of peace and environmental activism. To understand this, I conducted over 2 years of an organizational ethnography of CTEC, an environmental peacebuilding organization operating in the Palestinian-Israeli context. While organizational members from different ethno-national and generational groups had diverse perspectives, this study points to overarching trends supported by the multi-method data collection. CTEC emerged during the height of the Oslo peace process in the 1990s, a time of hope and possibility for many in the region. The organization focuses on environmental education and cooperation between Israelis, Palestinians, and Jordanians, bringing together diverse cohorts of young people to participate in an immersive educational program. Many of these participants remain involved as organizational members after completing the program, thus creating a dynamic intergenerational space within CTEC. In the following slides, I'll lay out the main findings, which point to the fact that at an emic level, meaning from the perspective of the research subjects themselves, they fall into two political generations. The impact of generational identities on organizational dynamics can be seen in divergent understandings of their approach toward peace and the environment and tensions around ideology, authority, and values. Over time, this has contributed to organizational change, although there remain tensions over how quickly or not this occurs. The findings reveal the emergence of two distinct political generations, each shaped by its experiences during different phases and with different approaches to both peace and the environment. The Oslo generation was much more influenced by their liberal peacebuilding framework prevalent at the time the organization was founded, which saw their particular grassroots efforts as separate from state-building processes. In contrast, the post-Oslo generation is much more influenced by an emancipatory approach to peacebuilding that centers more on root causes and social justice. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to run through a few examples. For example, it was much more common for members of the Oslo generation to be much less political, saying things like, part of our DNA was that we don't take sides in the conflict because we want to hear all sides. This is in contrast to members of the post-Oslo generation who were often explicitly critical of the Oslo Accords and spoke much more about social justice and root issues. For example, a post-Oslo member shared, in any organizations that are children of the Oslo Accords, they are grounded in that paradigm, in the two-state solution and shaking hands. And I think that's changed on the ground, and the younger organizational members reflect that and are much more aware of social justice issues and systemic oppression. And as Rana said, at the end of the day, what good does it do to have a healthy or clean environment if there's no freedom to enjoy it? I don't want to participate in any narrative that reduces this to just an environmental conversation. What we're seeing here is a shift in perspectives toward peace and the environment from a liberal framework to a justice-based framework. Thus, in my work, I also characterize the Oslo generation as Generation Peace and the post-Oslo generation as Generation Justice. These are various areas of organizational tension as indicated by members of the different social generations. There were differences in ideology and in how they appealed to authority or centrality in terms of influencing the work. The older generation who are in senior leadership had organizational power, but the younger generation often appealed to discursive power. The Oslo generation would emphasize the need to be pragmatic and not being seen as too political, as well as the desire to be seen as professionals. This contrasted with many in the post-Oslo generation who often said things like, many in this younger generation, especially Palestinians, don't identify with this ideology that fails to address the ongoing occupation, apartheid, and ethnic cleansing of an entire people. At the very least, CTEC needs to acknowledge the imbalance of power and the occupation's environmental impact on Palestinian communities. Again, I only have time to show select quotes to demonstrate this, but when it came to authority, they often pointed to their centrality in the organization and how they saw their role as trying to get CTEC in line with the more progressive positions on peace and the environment, which is reminiscent of the opening quote from Amir as well. There was also tension around organizational values, both how and to what extent these were implemented. While change is slow and there's resistance to some of the changes, the persistence of the younger generation has led to gradual shifts in CTEC's language, practices, and mission. Both as younger organizational members increasingly become part of the long-term staff and have more influence, and in response to the pressure over time, CTEC has slowly adjusted aspects of its language, action, and mission, incorporating a stronger emphasis on justice. While there is not consensus in CTEC about why these changes have occurred, I have many examples of the post-Oslo generation in particular, noting certain changes and indicating their contribution to it. So what are the generalizable implications here? First, organizations, especially as social movements shift in response to large political or environmental issues, or as a conflict extends over a protracted period and is marked by shifts in conflict phases, are increasingly seeing an emphasis on generation as an important identity that is associated with, but not only affected by age. As these different generations come into organizations, we can see tensions manifesting around the direction or discourse of a movement or organization. And there's a need to, as one senior member put it, to learn how to work intergenerationally in a way that doesn't feel disrespectful to a new generation, but that is not threatening to an older generation. To draw a lesson in this intergenerational social conflict from John Paul Lederach, conflict transformation requires us to envision and respond to the ebb and flow of social conflict as life-giving opportunities for creating constructive change processes that reduce violence, increase justice in direct interaction and social structures, and respond to real-life problems in human relationships. Generational turnover and intergenerational tensions can be one such opportunity for constructive change as organizations are challenged to confront existing paradigms and integrate new perspectives. Thank you. And now I'm going to introduce our next speaker and just remove this from my screen. And all right, next we're going to hear from Mohammad Al-Azraq, who is an environmental and economic development consultant with over 20 years of experience across North America and the MENA region. He served as the Capacity Building and Network Development Manager at the Arab Foundation's Forum and was the Senior Officer for Philanthropy and Social Investing at the American University in Cairo. He has received the Leaders for Democracy Fellowship at Syracuse University and the Atkin Fellowship for Arab-Israeli Peace at King's College London. Thank you, Mo.
Sorry, yeah. Thank you very much, Ambreen. Appreciate it. Today I'll be kind of building a little bit on what Ambreen talked about. So my context as well is still the kind of Israeli-Palestinian, but also broader Middle Eastern context. And I'll be talking a bit about a particular group that was trying to navigate the intergenerational tension that exists within the environment and climate movement in Israel, Palestine, but also in the broader region. At first, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, and basically these are territories that were settled by Western kind of forces, and it really behooves us at an environmental conference to acknowledge that. So I really, as an immigrant, I'm especially grateful to the First Nations for their care for and teachings about our earth and our relations, and may we honor those teachings. The overview of the paper that we co-wrote together, and I also want to preface, like Ambreen did, this was done quite a bit before the current war, so things are, right now, the dynamics have definitely changed. But it really, this paper investigates this young professional group, which is formed of Middle Eastern, about 40 young environmentalists and concerned individuals from across the region. And their purpose was to try to basically create a kind of a platform to address the growing climate challenges collaboratively by emphasizing equality, freedom, and social justice. So one of the salient themes of that paper was that intergenerational tension that exists between more kind of older folks here. When just to kind of clarify that, we're really talking about potentially, like, in a scale that maybe everybody can understand, like the boomer and Gen Xers versus millennials and Gen Z, because we're looking at that kind of pivotal moment that Ambreen touched upon, which is the signing of the Oslo Accords in 1993. So the older generation is usually characterized by those who have been active prior to or at the time of the Oslo Accord, active, i.e. they were fully informed adults, actively engaged in the political and environmental discourse. And then the younger generations, though, that kind of came of age a little later. And we're talking here about the second intifada in about 2000. So that's basically the two generations, or more than two generations, that we're talking about. The causes for that kind of tension really varies, but what we were able to capture through these interviews were the differences in values, communication styles, and access to resources, and that means also material, money, and funding. So the timeline for that group was between 2018 and 2021. So it lasted for about 3 years. It was an experiment that also was very much impacted by COVID. And that's why a lot of the changes happened and how the group kind of wound down. And there's some efforts now to pick it back up, but that's where kind of the most active period. The group's purpose was to really emphasize regional cooperation, social justice, and sustainability. It comprised, as I mentioned, of about 40 individuals that came from about 7 countries from the MENA region, although I would say the majority of whom came from Israel and Palestine. There were some active members from other countries, but it was a majority Israeli-Palestinian. In terms of what we were able what that group was able to achieve was that basically there was an organization of in-person events as well as online meetings that, as you can imagine, especially starting in 2020, the transition to predominantly 100% online happened. Basically, the idea here was to try to develop a vision that focused on regional integration. That kind of started to become a little bit more salient in a conversation after the signing of the Abraham Accords. Just a very quick preface on that: it's the kind of peace accords that Israel signed with some of its Arab sort of broader neighbors. They include the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco. What were the challenges that basically that group faced? It's basically characterized by two really main things: the navigating that kind of cross-border challenges. You can see here on the upper right corner, that's kind of an AI-generated image of the separation wall in the West Bank. And that kind of created a very big challenge in terms of trying to get people to meet. And just to show you how that exacerbates the intergenerational tension, if I want to take you back to before the first Intifada. The first Intifada started in 1987. In 1987. And before that, Palestinians, who again were part of that, maybe Gen X or Boomer generation, were able to move freely in the entire land. So if you were a Palestinian from Ramallah, for example, you could drive your car and go to the sea with your family before the first Intifada. Things start to change after that, and restrictions started to be imposed on Palestinian mobility. So their ability to access certain and also interact with Israeli society in a more symbiotic, in a healthier way, started to become a bit of a challenge. And so that's one of the main things, is that the avenues for meetings start to shrink. And you can see me here say that Cyprus has become the new Middle East, because that's where people are flocking to in a kind of a region that is increasingly hostile to meeting and cross-border cooperation. So the group did kind of build on that momentum there as well. Funding is persistent. If you work in any nonprofit setting, you know that. Things cost money, and it turned out that people like money. They like to be paid. Coffee costs money, and rent costs money, and people enjoy getting paid. So basically, that is one of the things that we discovered. Surprise, surprise. In terms of the specific projects that the group worked on, there were about 4 categories. Or more, I must say here that in our conversations with members of that group, some projects moved faster than others. So the first one, the environmental consultancy, moved farthest in terms of development. It was spearheaded by an Israeli and a Palestinian who capitalized on that moment of the Abraham Accords that I mentioned earlier. So they traveled to the UAE to try to develop a relationship, and the purpose of that is to kind of develop internal capacity that acts as a consultancy. So for things like climate change adaptation, mitigation strategies, renewable energy, water, agriculture, industrial symbiosis, circular economy, all of these things that are relevant to the environment or sustainability, to kind of lend their expertise and kind of like support organizations across the region in developing those. There was a mentoring program for future leaders and entrepreneurs as well, that builds on examples that do exist in Israel-Palestine. There's a program called the Palestinian Internship Program, and another one called the Palestinian Mentorship Program that brings Palestinian tech entrepreneurs as well as kind of tech workers to be trained in Israeli high tech, and that the purpose of that is to bridge that knowledge gap between the two people. So that was kind of to build upon that and try to take it to the region as opposed to only Israel-Palestine. There's an advocacy task force which was really focused on trying to influence decision makers in the EU and the US in terms of specifically funding that are geared towards peace building and particularly environmental action. In terms of the policy recommendations, there were about 5 that came up from that research. There's the idea of creating more inclusive decision-making spaces that include both all generations, if you will, involved, because now we're talking about older and younger, but even the older is about 2 generations, and the younger is also about 2. It's millennials and Gen Z, Xers and Boomers for the older generation. Intergenerational equity is basically trying to balance those things and build, and as well as build relations and shared goals. And creating more kind of transparency and autonomy in decision making, so allowing more younger people to actually take charge of organizations, of decision making, of programs. And like I said, money matters, and so trying to create more equitable representation in grants and grant management, and ensuring inclusive collaboration in that space. The conclusion here is that the essence was that intergenerational collaboration is crucial for effective environmental action, because these older generations are still, they still do hold power, and therefore younger people need to include them in that. But also more and more younger people are becoming of age, and they have a lot of experiences under their belt, and therefore should be taken a bit more seriously. What we can learn from this is that this is kind of a kind of microcosm of potentially other broader regional grouping that we can learn from, especially that one that brings people along sides of conflict. And with that, I hand it back to Ambreen to present the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mo. I'd like to present our final speaker, Elsa Barron, who is an environmental peace and security researcher, writer, poet, and youth activist. She's a research fellow at the Center for Climate Security and Institute of the Council on Strategic Risks. She has worked on environment, climate, and peace-related research and advocacy at the Institute for Climate and Peace, Faith and Place, the Payne Institute for Public Policy, the Wilson Center Environmental Change and Security Program, and the NGO Committee on Financing for Development. The floor is yours, Elsa.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Ambreen, for all the work you did to bring us together today. I'm very excited that I'm going last, because I get to sort of build on many of the topics you all have covered, and hopefully do justice to some of the points you've made. So I'm going to be talking today about youth perspectives on climate, peace, and security, specifically from the policy realm. And I'll really be diving into the COP process and COP28 as a key example throughout the presentation. So aptly to introduce, I'll start with a story from COP last year, where I was part of conversations and heard conversations from YOUNGO, which is the youth constituency to the UN, in the final days of the negotiation, and in the exact final day, about how they were going to make their voices heard. And the realization very explicitly said in these conversations that youth voices were not included in the substantial decision-making process. And so one of the only avenues available was through protest imagery and ensuring that the media shared the message through image. And so you see that it was successful, this strategy that was taken by YOUNGO to really speak through protest and to speak through image, that it got through to the media in terms of the coverage of the final agreement. And the message in this case was that young people were looking for a more ambitious commitment in this case of COP28. And so I think this is a really interesting example of creativity and success. But I also think it's important to address the root challenge here, which is that young people's voices aren't included in the substantive decision-making spaces. And so how do we ensure that it's not only their images that are being used, but also their ideas and thoughts and perspectives? So just to overview quickly what I will touch on. First, I'll talk about the current challenge, the impact of climate, peace, and security on young people and their exclusion from policy spaces. I'll also talk about policy recommendations that already exist, showcasing young people's leadership and imagining a more peaceful, secure, and climate just future. And then finally, the shifting frames of thinking that young people can bring into this realm and the interconnectedness of these challenges and investment priorities that young people perceive. So first, I'll talk about the challenge, and I think this is really a juxtaposition of the impact of climate change on young people and their exclusion from decision making. And I'll take a moment to really thank Katie Waters at the United States Institute of Peace for collaborating with me on some of this thinking. We recently published an article called "A Livable Climate Needs Help from Youth. The U.S. Can Foster It," where we really parsed out some of these challenges. So I have to give her credit for that collaboration. So in terms of the significance of young people, of the world's 1.8 billion people between the ages of 10 and 24, 80% live in conflict-affected states or economically developing states, which researchers have identified are particularly impacted by climate change, which not only has these physical impacts, but also impacts social cohesion, governance, and erode resilience. And this is particularly impactful for young people, and it also has an impact on mental health and well-being. And so you just see the myriad of ways that climate change is really relevant to young people and impacting their lives and their futures. While on the other hand, you often see the exclusion of young people. There's a new term, well, I don't know how new it is, but a helpful term called youth washing to describe the nominal inclusion of young people, often for the photo op or for the image of it, without a good faith effort to include their perspectives and their thoughts. And I thought Bota did a really nice job of describing this earlier too, and how that has shown up in their work. So how do we address this division? And I think the reality is that young people's substantive thoughts on climate, peace, and security policy are already out there in many ways and really robust and well thought out. So ahead of each COP, there's a group of young people that come together to publish a global youth statement from across the world. So the COP28 Global Youth Statement represented 750,000 young people from across 160 countries and had an entire section dedicated to climate, peace, and security, which I think is really impressive and not enough people know about. And it covered these 5 topics. The first was vulnerable communities and equity, ensuring that policymakers acknowledge and address the disproportionate impacts of climate change on certain communities. And this really dives into the climate justice aspect. And I think it's interesting that they really centered climate justice in the peace and security conversation. So this also connects a lot with what Mohammad and Ambreen were saying about from this young person's perspective and how that weaves into all of the other priorities. The second priority here is on resource management and conflict prevention, ensuring that projects are funded, that projects that are funded are conflict sensitive, and that communities affected by conflict receive funding, which is oftentimes a major gap. A third point on climate-induced migration and displacement, ensuring that the legal status of climate refugees are recognized and that there are inclusive strategies for accommodating displaced people where necessary. Again, really weaving together justice and peace and security issues. The fourth point is around youth engagement and peace building, investing in existing local peace building initiatives that are youth-led, that integrate climate resilience, that address mental health and trauma recovery. I think this ties in nicely with what Natalija was saying about the different ways that communities can lead. And then finally, cross-border collaboration and diplomacy, which is perhaps the most standard kind of thinking around transboundary water agreements or other ways that nation states can collaborate. But I think that this is just really important to promote and to recognize that youth have been doing really great thinking in the policy realm on these topics. I'll also plug, there was a group of young leaders from NATO member countries that were brought together through a project at the Center for Climate and Security that brought these young leaders to the NATO summit. And based on their experience, they created some suggestions and policy recommendations as well that covered continued youth engagement, accountability in climate security dialogues at the highest level to ensure that they're translating into action, and prioritizing engagement with member states to deepen action on climate mitigation and adaptation. And so, again, just another example where really important policy perspectives are coming out. And then the third point that I want to talk about are the shifting frames of thinking of young people in this space. And young people are much more likely to break down silos when they think about climate, peace, and security policy. So they're much less likely to see strict divisions between these topics, and therefore strict divisions between the potential solutions. And so even with the global youth statement, you see the way that issues around justice and peace building and or migrants and displaced communities are really woven together and seen as a holistic package that needs to be addressed. And that's a real characteristic of young professionals in this space. It shows up in intersectional activism as well. This image is from COP28 as well, but you can see the flag represents the COP28 coalition, which is an umbrella of a number of causes, climate justice issues, but also the land back movement, Gaza solidarity, debt justice, sort of all coming together under an intersectional lens to address the climate justice issue. And then you also see shifting priorities for young people who are often on the front lines of experiencing climate impacts and therefore have a different understanding of even the term security, which is often thrown around in this space. So, for example, Pew Research in the US shows that older generations are much more likely to prioritize strengthening the military, 59% of people 65 and older, whereas younger generations, there are only 18% of people who prioritize strengthening the military, whereas in contrast, 46% of people 18 to 29 said that dealing with climate change should be a top priority. And so you see how
one more minute.
There are different thank you, priorities for investment that can really shape policy moving forward as well. So just to quickly wrap up with this image in mind as well, and returning to the idea of youth activism as COP as an important example here, it's also interesting to note and important to note that while these movements are often portrayed as youth-led, they're actually very intergenerational in nature. And youth may be at the front, but collaboration is at the core. And I think it's important to build on the strength of these movements and these collaborations in thinking about climate, peace, and security policy moving forward.
Thank you so much, Elsa. Thank you to all of you for these really, really interesting presentations. I would like to invite all of the attendees with us to feel free to start submitting questions in the Q&A, or you're welcome to, if you'd like to chat, offer comments there that aren't questions, you're more than welcome to. And if I don't see any questions coming in quickly, I actually have a lot of questions. Or our panelists are also welcome to pose questions broadly or to one another, and depending on how many we have coming through, I might direct particular questions to certain people for the sake of time. But as we're waiting for questions to come in, I guess I'll just broadly ask to start us off. For maybe some of you to volunteer to answer, how can environmental peace building organizations and initiatives in particular create more inclusive and equitable spaces for youth participation and decision making, taking into account whether it's power asymmetries or cultural factors like you mentioned, Bota, in your presentation? I'd love to hear some of you respond to that. Go ahead, Elsa. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if we're raising hands or jumping in, but maybe I'll start with like level 1 of this, and I hope others can jump in with more advanced levels perhaps. But I think one thing I notice within organizations is that the work of young people is often sort of assumed to be for free. And a couple people mentioned that money is often a factor that is a challenge or an inhibitor of action. And I think that if organizations really want to create that space for young people, there's a lot of work, even just in organizing and in community building to create spaces like that. And I think acknowledging that labor and prioritizing it through, adequate pay and funding is kind of step 1. And then there are so many other things that can come after that.
It's great. Natalija.
Thanks, Ambreen. So adding to that point, everyone identified financial input as being one of the barriers. That's something that Bota and I and others found in a report that we did looking at how young people engage in transboundary water management. Then there's, of course, that social and cultural acceptance in societies where there's a stronger hierarchy between young people and older generations. It's harder for them to engage more formally and to get their ideas across, especially if they're more transformative. Then there's that sustainable institutional support and inclusion not being piecemeal, but actually actively engaging young people in a non-tokenized way. Community connection and mobilization, recognizing the value of networks and what that affords young people to engage in environmental peace building and to connect across borders. And then capacity and skills development. Young people is a very broad category. I mean, in places it goes up until the age of 35. So that's also something to consider. And then lastly, their security. Sometimes people literally cannot speak and say what they need to.
Thank you. Bota.
Yeah, just a quick maybe point to raise, because also I mentioned that in my presentation that there are such a separate spaces for like those who are decision makers and for young people. I think it is so much valuable to bring them together and to also to speak about youth and their engagement, not only with young people, not to empower them only, but also those who are making those decisions, because I think they just hear this that young people are important, but then and maybe they genuinely want to involve them, but at the same time they just don't know how. And in that sense, education awareness raising is our formula for everything. But I think here it's also very important.
Thank you. Mo.
Thank you. Well, I think the challenges of creating inclusive spaces, I think, takes a special kind of point in the Middle East. I live in North America. I live in Canada, and here, and I'm involved in indigenous, non-indigenous conversations in my capacity at the university, and it's not difficult. It's not frowned upon. It's actually very much encouraged for indigenous and non-indigenous people who are still in some form of conflict as Canada moves forward on its 94 calls to action that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission produced. It's very much encouraged for young people, indigenous and non-indigenous, to meet and discuss and develop those relationships. Contrast to what we have in the Middle East, where it's frowned upon to do that by social pressures. And so that really, again, when I said in my presentation that Cyprus has become the Middle East, what I meant by that is Cyprus has become the refuge that people are taking away from, like, slightly just off shores from their homes, so that they can meet safely, comfortably, and discuss the work that they want to do together. Because in their own local environment, it's become very hostile to meet. There's not just security challenges. There's also immense social pressure not to do so, and it becomes really overbearing in many instances. So that I think is where the uniqueness of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is, and I want to just take you back to that moment when I said that there's values that are different between the generations. Again, it's because of that mobility issue that really, I think, exacerbated that. So the belief in the Gen Xer and more so in the Boomer generation that incremental traditional approaches would be better to build trust, and we don't need transformative, accelerated change that young people now want to see, is because they were a product of a different era. That kind of generation I'm talking about, the younger one, became adults in the 2000s, again, after the kind of relative collapse of the Oslo Accords and the move towards the Second Intifada. Their environment was shaped by the construction of the wall in the West Bank and the ensuing challenges. So their interactions have become a lot more restricted and really kind of engineered in a lot of ways. And so that, I think, is where creating inclusive spaces, and I'm sorry to say that the only solution I have is really to build more spaces slightly offshores, like in Cyprus, and allow for more interactions to happen more frequently, for that trust to be rebuilt.
Thank you very much. We also have a question from Noam Brenner, and I just want to say to all the attendees, please feel free to share any questions for somebody specific here, or just in general. We would be very happy to answer it. Noam, thank you for your question. He is asking, how do we draw the line between generations? Is it age? Is it transformative events? And in my work, at least, I'll just go ahead and get us started. I look at this from a sociological generation perspective. Mannheim looks at it based off of an age, period, and cohort effect. And a lot of people, when they talk about generations, they focus on age and cohort. So, generation X, Y, Z, or, youth entering into the workforce, or, young adult, or different sorts of ages like that, in terms of those sorts of groups. I think that plays a part, certainly. I go back to Mannheim because I think he helps us also understand something with his period effect and those transformative political movements. So at least in my research, this is how I conceptualize it. Although I see there's value in looking at it from different perspectives. So I don't have a hard and fast way of looking at it, other than kind of when people's either political consciousness was formed around a certain event, or they kind of entered into this movement and take on an ideology that became very prevalent at that particular period. I know, Elsa, you were reading a definition. I think you went up to, maybe you'd like to repeat the definition that you provided. If anyone else would like to jump in, you're welcome to.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's a great question. And I think the statistic I read defined youth between the ages of 10 and 24. But that's actually more of a children and youth definition. There are definitions that go from 18 to 30, even 18 to 35 sometimes. So I think it's hard to find a universal range to discuss. And then also sometimes the distinction between children and youth is drawn very strongly. Sometimes it's more woven together. Actually, when Katie and I were collaborating on some of our analysis, we found that it was challenging to weave statistics together because they had these different definitions. But at the end of the day, we determined that it was all still useful pieces of information to sort of piece together into the larger picture. And so I think I think it's very useful if there's sort of a standardized definition of youth, so that different analyses are comparable and can be compared to each other. At the same time, I don't think we should let that distract us from doing the thinking more generally about the differences between different groups and different levels of inclusion, in particular for young people, which is what a lot of these statistics were addressing. So I think there's definitely a balance there.
Natalija, would you like to add something?
Yeah. So in the research that we did, we actually found the exact opposite. Rather than standardizing young people as a general category or a youth bulge, it's necessary to see the variance across projects, policies, and research, and some of the social, economic, and political marginalization that many of these young people face. So in some places, young people might not be as advanced, depending on where they're situated, what is happening in their country, whether they're able to attain what adulthood might usually look like. And even within the same country, based off of socioeconomic factors, they might not demonstrate what it is to be in that elder bracket.
Mm. So I guess I would like to follow up with a question to that in terms of also when we've talked a lot about inclusion, right? This has been a word I think we've used a lot. If we had a word bubble, it would appear quite largely from all of our discussions. And I'd like to pose a question to us in terms of when and how does inclusion work and when might it not? Like what does it mean, you know, in these senses? And would love to hear your thoughts on this. And I can get us started if someone else doesn't have something. Bota, do you have something? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking in terms of this ladder of, I'm not sure, was it ladder of inclusivity or ladder of participation? I think there are also like different levels, and I think the same applies for me in terms of inclusivity. So at least in Central Asian context, I think inclusivity would sound like having young people in the room somewhere, even if it will be a very passive role. So that's something that would mean inclusivity for other generation or for those who are like in the decision-making position. Versus for me, it is very passive form of inclusivity, and then more like in a full sense of it, inclusivity would mean of treating young people as equals in a way, like creating opportunities for them to, or enabling environment for them to really unlock their potential for like, share their opinion and really having their opinion or voice influencing certain decisions or just opinions of other participants who are there in the room. So I think for me, this is where these a bit of this gradations are.
The scale, I was even thinking a lot when you were speaking, like we were talking about it in terms of tokenization almost. You and Elsa both really had that very strongly, I think, in your presentations. I'd also like just to say to the audience and attendees, feel free to keep sending in more questions. Mo, go ahead.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm watching for to see is if we see a carry on of that kind of intergenerational tension from, like, as I said, the Gen Xers and now potentially only millennials, because they're the ones that are of age to be in kind of more advanced and senior positions. Gen Z is still kind of coming into the labor force and you know, kind of rising up that ladder. The oldest of which is still 26, 27. And so what I'm trying to see is like is whether or not we're going to see a carry on. So meaning, while millennials, as they advance in age and seniority, will they start to act and sort of, you know, look on a Gen Z as like, oh, you know, like you don't have enough experience, we know better, you're trying to kind of change things and impede their participation or not. So I think in the Middle Eastern context, that's kind of what I'm watching for. Is as now we're kind of, I'm considered in that kind of definition of millennial, would be among the oldest. I was born in 81, which is the very kind of cut at which that generation starts. You know, people may have varying definitions, but the Pew Research Institute defines it as 81 to 97, born basically like year of birth. And so I think that will be like, as my generation now becomes that senior directors and executive directors in their organizations, whether or not they will apply different approaches to decision making and more inclusive approaches to democratized work. I think, again, funding remains to be crucial, because until now, most of these kind of sign-off decisions is still predominantly in these organizations held by boomers and Gen Xers. So even though millennials are, you know, 43 years old, they're still in most cases are encumbered by older generations hesitation to democratize the process of decision making, especially on funding, because most of these organizations are founded by slightly older folks. Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, Elsa.
Thanks. Yeah, I think echoing some of these points too, there's a distinction between different types of inclusion. We talked about youth washing, we talked about tokenization, but I think a real indicator of positive inclusion is dissenting inclusion. versus replicating inclusion, where you see this with all different sorts of groups where people who sort of already fit the mold of existing thinking are included, whereas others who have different perspectives, perhaps reflecting generational shifts, are not included because they might challenge the status quo. And so you find someone who can sort of just easily slip into the existing norms and the existing system. And so I think when you have cases of inclusion where there's also openness to dissent, and sort of open conversation about that, that's a real indicator that you're moving away from youth washing, or you're moving away from tokenization, and there's a genuine space for inclusion and for discussion where people feel safe expressing their opinions, because there can also be a lot of self-censorship in these spaces and in these discussions if there's not a blanket of safety that people will not be sort of expelled from the community or from the conversation based on their opinion or perspective.
Thank you. Natalija.
So that's actually one of the reasons why we had started the Water Youth Network, because of that tokenization of young people. We really wanted to show the young people can bring forward a transformative vision of what water policy entails, from talking about circular economy back in 2012, before it was really popularized, to advancing ideas that weren't yet in the zeitgeist. And at the same time, we also acknowledged the precarity for one's career to be that advocate for more transformative practices, especially for those that do not have any alternative economic fallbacks. And then building upon the point that Bota was making earlier in terms of the different forms of inclusion of young people, not just as recipients, but as active co-creators and processes. Sometimes when the environment is more securitized, it's much harder for young people to make the case to engage so actively in constructing policy.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, one thing I don't actually wrestle with as much in this paper, in my paper, but it does come up, is in terms of there's an integration of more and more, of this post-Oslo generation into the work, but part of that integration, there's pressure to be more political, right? To be to use different discourse, to be involved in different sorts of action, which in my case, right, it's my unit of analysis is an organization looking at this very much in depth over time. But, part of the organization's work is also working with partners that if you are, too inflammatory, too political per se, like maybe that would jeopardize a particular partnership where you need institutional partners in order to get certain things done. You need partnerships with certain security apparatus to try and move different environmental interventions across borders, right? When we're in an active conflict context. And so you need these people to be partners. And if you are seen as a protest movement, as one of the senior members told me, like, this will inhibit your ability to actually do concrete environmental work. And on the contrary, so they're trying to be more inclusive and trying to integrate these perspectives. And then, but it does create these tensions. And so I think it's also a question, and I liked the way that you put it, Elsa, in terms of having dissenting inclusion, the importance of having dissenting inclusion. I think that's certainly something I've seen over the course of my work. And there's different perspectives, like about how, okay, what do you do with that dissenting, inclusion? And in my work, I've seen that, okay, over time, I think it has been incorporated. It's just often some people say, okay, by the time, okay, now you use the term two-state solution and we're not using this term anymore. We're going on to other language. Okay, great. You use the word occupation. Great. About 20 years too late, but okay. And so it's there's a bit of I think, a tensions that will still remain. I think there's more there's more thought needed about, like, how do we do this well? And you've all raised really interesting points. I want to give you all also the opportunity to pose a question. I actually have a really long list, but you're welcome to also jump in and ask something as well. So something else I'm wondering, so feel free to stop me if you want to ask something. What is the role of a broader social justice discourse in the youth or younger generational oriented discourse in the various contexts and perspectives you all are coming from with your cases?
Yeah, well, I could quickly just share with the experience that I have from Marley Basin that this environmental justice discourse is not that much coined among, I think, both decision makers and even youth, I would say, but also like very young youth that we discussed before, like teenage and young youth. I think they are more having it something to discuss and maybe to raise awareness about that a bit. But these haven't been in the discussion, let's say, among across the borders, let's say.
Mhm. Mhm. Interesting.
I think that in terms of the policy perspectives in an already intersectional field, where a lot of people already wonder what's the connection between climate and peace, what's the connection between climate and justice. It's oftentimes young people who are sort of leading the way in defining the nexus of these terms. And I think justice is very much woven throughout those topics and done very seamlessly. So if you think of climate change as more of a systems-based challenge, which I think younger generations are more and more likely to do, then the solutions go across those same systems. So if it's not just an environmental problem, but it's also an economic problem, it's a governance problem, and it's a justice problem, then the solutions you're imagining have to be bigger in the sense that they encompass those different realms and aren't just solely addressing the environmental impacts, which are very substantial. I think in this case are oftentimes the symptoms of a root cause that also needs to be addressed if this is to be cut off for the longer term. And so I think justice is core to that approach, and even the way of thinking about it, the framing of the issue, and the real sort of root solutions are not possible without really wrestling with the justice question.
Thank you, Mo.
Again, I think the contrast I would like to highlight here between achieving social justice in the context in which I live, North America, and the context in which this paper was written on, which is the Middle East. And this kind of, could draw some contrast between my presentation and Natalia's. If we look at the 94 calls to action that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada developed in 2015, they're clear, articulated metrics for achieving reconciliation in the Canadian context. There's hardly anybody I met that contests that says this is, not mine. I didn't really sign on to this, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a clear understanding. Progress is slow, and Indigenous people will corroborate that. But right now we're seeing a move, for example, and that relates very much to the environment, the idea of indigenizing fossil fuels. So a lot of energy projects, whether it's the Trans Mountain Pipeline, whether even in the US, like the Alaska's Willow Project, were only approved because of Indigenous consent, not only Indigenous consent, but Indigenous participation in the revenue making of these projects. So right now we're gearing towards more really I think aggressive and in a way positively aggressive inclusion, okay, of those that had been marginalized historically, but because there's a national consensus, okay, or I would argue binational consensus, as Indigenous people do consider themselves as an independent nation that live in in this land. Therefore, you're having that kind of really contrasted reality from what we have in the Middle East, whereby there is no agreement whatsoever on what is to become of this land and what how could people share it equitably and justly. So the achievement of social justice, I think, really, kind of starts with kind of visionary leaders, and I'm unfortunately still struggling to find those in the sea of environmental activists in the region. And I'm sorry to like maybe paint a little bit of a challenging picture, but you probably, if anybody puts on the news and sees what's going on in the region, probably can understand that it is unfortunately unique in ways that we would like it not to be. But that's kind of where the challenge is that the agreement, like there's no, it's a very dichotomous vision of what this land should be and how people should live on it.
Thank you so much. I would like to just kind of bring our session to a close, to be mindful of the time. So thank you all for such an engaging and insightful discussion. As we bring our session to a close, I'd like to highlight some key themes and takeaways maybe that have emerged from today. Firstly, the importance of recognizing and valuing the unique contributions of each generation cannot be overstated, including what young people are bringing and their new ideas, and seeing the interconnections that Elsa also spoke about a lot in her work. Secondly, addressing the barriers to youth engagement is also essential, that so many of us have also mentioned in what we presented. We've heard about the challenges of political, social, and institutional constraints, but also some of the potential solutions that can empower young people to take a more active role in shaping our environmental future. Also, our panelists have shared inspiring examples of innovative practices that bridge generational divides, from watershed management to cross-border boot camps and advocacy initiatives, as well as the intergenerational collaboration behind youth activism and protests. These examples underscore the power of combining diverse perspectives to create more holistic and sustainable solutions. And so in conclusion, today's discussion has reaffirmed the need for policies and frameworks that support intergenerational collaboration as well as youth integration, and ensure that these younger voices are not only heard, but also have a tangible impact. Thank you once again to all of our panelists, to all of the attendees, and all of you for your participation. It was a pleasure to spend the past hour and a half with you. Also, thank you to Carl, to Alice, to Natalija for the tech support here, and the rest of the support team and the organizing committee for helping make this happen. And as the attendees begin to leave, I'm going to